context of white supremacy, Gus T Renegade and Justice in for another episode to hopefully share constructive information about racism, what it is, how it works, and suggestions for working against racism. This is probably the quickest turnaround I have ever had between programs to just finish up a show with Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. That was not planned, spontaneous, just worked out. I think it was very constructive. You should check it out. Neely Fuller Jr., he was on about 10 minutes before the show started. Started a little late, but we are here, and guest, I believe, is ready to roll. Today's guest, our second guest today, Dr. Martin Kevorkian. He's at the University of Texas, Austin. He authored Color Monitors. When he was on the show in May, he suggested 2 books. When asked about whether or not he was a white person, he said, yes, he is a white person, and he's an admitted white supremacist. He mentioned Professor Ian Haney Lopez's book, White by Law. Professor Lopez, if you all have been following the C.O.W.S, Professor Lopez was on the program in August, shared incredibly constructive information about the history of court cases dealing with who gets to be classified as white and how white people, suspected racists, make those decisions. Dr. Martin Kevorkian also recommended today's guest and one of her books. The book he recommended was What Blood Won't Tell, and this book, very, very interesting. I learned a ton reading it, particularly around how white people, racists, manipulate racial classifications to their benefit when it's to pit other non-white people against each other, to restrict who is white, who's classified as white, and how they actually make these determinations. But she explores this from a lot of different angles, analyzing how these categories have changed with relation to who gets to be white and who gets to be classified as so-called Native American, who gets to be classified as so-called Hawaiian, how they make these determinations. Very, very interesting book. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I found it surprisingly honest for a white person. Hopefully she can share about that. Our guest for today's program, forgive me in advance if I mispronounce the name. I will get it correct as we go on the program. Our guest for today's program, University of Southern California, Ariela Gross. Let me make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. Did I get your first name correct, ma'am?
Close. It's Ariela.
Ariela. That's not even in the ballpark. I was way off. Professor Ariela Gross. Okay, so I'm saying it correctly now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. If you could please share with our listeners as much constructive information about who you are, what you do, what you teach at the University of Southern California, please.
Sure. I'm a legal historian. I teach mainly in the law school, and my research is in the area of United States and also comparative history of race, slavery, and law. And I teach history of American law. I teach race and gender in the law. Sometimes I teach contract law as well. And I came to this book from my first work, which was studying the American South and the everyday law of slavery. So I was interested in I'm very interested in the way law works at the day-to-day level, how people make meaning about race in day-to-day interactions, especially with interactions between the government and individuals, ordinary people. And that led to my interest in this work, which begins under slavery but goes all the way to the present day.
Mm-hmm. I definitely want to go more in depth as we explore your book on this particular program, because I said I learned a lot. I had never really looked at the area of the world as known as Hawaii and how racism, white supremacy played out there. So all that was new territory for me, as well as the thoroughness with which you. I'm sorry?
Me too. It was all really new for me. I learned a lot just doing the research for this book.
Okay. And hopefully we'll share some of that as we go with today's program. Before we get started, every program I first like to get clear. It's helpful for myself and our listeners. You are a white female, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. The name of this program, the C.O.W.S, Context of White Supremacy. I have unfortunately concluded that we are in a global system of racism, white supremacy, and the definition that I use for racism and white supremacy is a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they say is not white. Do you believe that such a system exists, and do you think that definition is accurate to describe that system?
I do think there is, that we can talk about a global system of white supremacy. I struggle with the way to describe what some people call institutional racism, structural racism, all of the ways that in the absence of intentional, malicious acts of racial domination, we nevertheless find ourselves in an unjust system of hierarchy and subordination, and I think that happens through the operation of institutions that don't necessarily require intentional, malicious minds behind them, and so some of your definition was quite kind of Machiavellian, and while I don't mean at all to minimize the importance of, people who are out there dedicating themselves to the purpose of white supremacy, I think what's insidious about racism is that it doesn't require that to flourish, and that's what makes it so hard to eradicate, is that even without people who've dedicated their lives to dominating people of color, we've ended up with a system and a world in which there is that subordination, and that's, I think, the real challenge for the 21st century is what do you do if you can't isolate the individuals anymore and you have a structural institutional situation? And the work of my book is really to try to say, how do we end up with this common sense of race that's so persistent even if we get rid of all overt racial classifications, even if we have people growing up trying to be colorblind, and yet we haven't really undone that system of racial hierarchy.
I agree totally. I do want to point out to our listeners, because one thing that I try to do, it helps me learn. I have noticed that many white people who have been on this program have initially scoffed at the definition because they have said it implies that white people are consciously participating in this system, and the system of white supremacy does not require conscious participation. And I like to be very clear in pointing out that my definition, at no point in that definition do I talk about whether or not people are consciously doing this. What I am saying is that at the end of the day, whether we call it institutional racism or system of white supremacy, what we're talking about is people who say that they are white, who uphold, maintain, expand, and refine the global system of white domination of people they say are not white. I think when you boil everything down, that's what we're talking about when we say a global system of racism, white supremacy, or institutional racism. Do you think that is an accurate way to describe what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think I do. I think that if you take out, I think that what I was noticing was the language of sort of dedicated to, which suggested some kind of, self-consciousness to kind of dedicating yourself to that end. But yeah, I think if you, take that word out, I think you're right. I think that we have to start from that point, and then comes the hard work of analyzing, how do we get here and how do we move forward?
I I think the word dedicated is vitally important, and in fact, as we go along, I intend to evidence from your work, What Blood Won't Tell, that white people who practice white supremacy have shown consistent dedication to maintaining, expanding, and refining the system of white supremacy. I think you document that very well in your book, and I think you wouldn't have.
Actually, I think you will find plenty of evidence.
Oh yeah,
History for that. There is plenty of it. But I guess what I want to what I do try to show, and this is I guess a piece that's harder to capture somehow. Ann Stoler, who's an anthropologist, talks about the idea of the mobility of racism. And that was something that really came through for me in the research that I did, that when you think you pin down, this is what it is, it's very mobile. It can change forms, and that's what makes it so hard to act against often, is that mobility, and so absolutely, people can be conscious individuals can be dedicating themselves to thinking of new ways to do the work, and likewise they can be acting in all kinds of ways where what they're thinking about is their own privilege and may not be focusing on the effects it's having. It can work in all those different ways, and I don't mean it for a moment. I'd be crazy after the research I've done to suggest that there's not lots of evidence of people dedicating themselves on an individual level and on a community and
global level.
And I this book only talks about the U.S., but you're right. It's the U.S. also reaching across the Pacific, and you could take that story international as well.
Okay. I didn't, as we talked there, I feel like I felt much more confident in asserting that I think that definition is accurate. I didn't hear a whole lot there that pointed to a better definition or anything that would suggest that I was way off target with my definition and conclusion about what we're operating under in the global system of white supremacy. I have a co-host. She is a non-white female. She is all of 10 years old, but she understands that we are being mistreated globally by the system of white supremacy, and I'm certain she has some questions to ask that will help her get a better understanding so we can replace this as soon as possible. Justice, are you there?
Hello?
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you.
Hello. Before I ask any questions, I would like to ask everybody on the call, try to speak at a vocabulary level I can understand. I am 10 years old. Thank you.
Do my best. I've got a 10-year-old and a 14-year-old. I'll certainly do my best. Just tell me when I'm using jargon that's gone too far. Hello?
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you.
Okay.
Justice, you can go right ahead if you're ready, Justice.
Okay. How do you get other white people to stop practicing racism, white supremacy?
Well, I hope this isn't a fudge answer, but I'm a historian, and so I don't spend a lot of time on strategy. That's not my expertise. What I do best is doing history, telling people that these are all the things that have been done. I try to draw a few lessons from it, but I by no means am not a political activist or a strategist, and so I don't hold myself out as having future prescriptions or answers for the future. I think the first step, which is the point of my book, is that the first step in getting white people to recognize racism and the continuing injustice in the world, and I'm focused especially on America, on the U.S., that the first step is to understand our history and understand that we're not done yet. Because I think a lot of people want to think we have a black president, we are post-racial. We heard that a lot in the last year. We're in a new post-racial time, and we don't recognize race in the law anymore. We are colorblind, and so everything is okay. And so the work I try to do is to show, well, if you look at the way history's gone in the last 200 years, and the way it works, which isn't just by naming races, but by using race to put people down, if you look at that history, you can't say, we're all done, it's over, we're post-race, and everything's fine. So I think whatever you decide as a strategy for the future, if you don't understand the past and how we got here, then you might think the answer is just be colorblind and everything's going to work out fine.
Okay. And you practice white supremacy every day?
What's that? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Justice.
How do you practice white supremacy every day?
Well, I probably take advantage of white privilege every day by the very fact of where I live and just by the fact of the institutions I've been lucky enough to have access to. But, you know, I will say that to the extent that I have consciousness about race and think about it, I try to practice the opposite of white supremacy. And, you know, I hope that everybody, and that's my goal, is to help, you know, have all white people stop practices of white supremacy. So there are certainly all kinds of ways that I'm advantaged by white privilege, but there are also other practices I don't have to participate in.
You said white privilege. May you please give a definition for that?
I guess I'm not sure I have a great definition. The access to institutions of, you know, elite institutions, which are a function of both white privilege, class privilege. I went to Ivy League schools, and I teach at an elite university. So I guess that would be, I can give examples more easily than I can give you a definition.
Do you think you can try to give me a definition? Because I know that I didn't say white privilege. I said white supremacy. If you can give a definition for white privilege.
So my definition in general would be my colleague, I'll put it this way, I have a colleague at UCLA, Cheryl Harris, who talks about, wrote a wonderful article called Whiteness as Property. and she talks about the dollar value of whiteness in American history and even today, and that white privilege is that usually unconscious acceptance of all the ways that white people have benefited from, whether it's government programs like the GI Bill and Social Security that benefited whites and not people of color, whether it's the access they've had to particular neighborhoods and schools. All of those things, I would say, are the residue of white privilege.
So that's your definition for it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm still here.
Do you have some more questions?
No, not right now.
Oh, okay. We'll let you think for a little bit. I just wanted to clarify before we hop into your book. Hopefully we can share constructive information from What Blood Won't Tell. I just wanted to ask, I have concluded that what produces what you call white privilege is the system of white supremacy. Do you think that's correct?
I do think that's correct. I also think that, but I also think, I guess, as a historian, that that we have to be able to take account of the way, I'll again be drawing on another one of my colleagues' work, but my colleague Daria Roismeyer, who's writing a book called Locked In. And her argument is, let's assume there's no continuing racism. I'm putting aside, what we might think about continuing white supremacy, just put it aside. Even if there were no continuing racism, we would still have a system of white privilege because of the locked-in legacy of all the history of white supremacy. And so part of what I want to emphasize is, and to me that's institutional racism, it's that build up over time and lock-in of all of the effects of the past, and that doesn't even require continuing racism to maintain itself. And so, and I don't say that to deny continuing racism, but I also want us to take account of all of that legacy of the past, which I think we're very quick to forget about in our very presentist culture.
Mm-hmm. I want to clarify, because this is something I have noted with many white people who discuss racism, white supremacy, and I think this is very important because this is not anything personal with you. I've seen a myriad of white people do this. I suspect it could be conscious, but maybe it's unconscious, but that's why I'm pointing it out. I have seen where white people will concede a point if a non-white person asks a question, and then they will talk so that what they originally conceded kind of gets diluted. And I think it's very important that non-white people, because non-white people tend to be a little bit confused about how racism, white supremacy works. Very important. White privilege is the product of the system of white supremacy. We had agreement on that. I think that's very important. I didn't want the listeners to miss that. And I also wanted to point out, it's been my experience that white people consistently are very comfortable talking about you don't have to be conscious to maintain a system of white supremacy, and that's why I want to hop to your book. You show in your book, you evidence a long legacy of conscious racism, white supremacy, where people were very aware of what they're doing. In fact, you have a chapter in your book where you talk about practicing racism, white supremacy, and what it boiled down to was you as a white person, part of your duty is to know how you are supposed to relate to non-white people and as inferiors in a system of white supremacy. Is that, and you can call me, am I reading your book correctly?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And another piece of it that I think is important is the section, especially my chapter on Mexican Americans in Texas and California, where a big part of what I saw in the record was people acting very consciously in a racist way, learning to speak the language of neutrality and, saying, oh, this isn't about race, it's about culture, or it's about language, or, we have all kinds of other reasons for why we're putting kids in these other worse schools. So you're absolutely right. There's lots of evidence of very conscious creation of race and racial subordination, and learning to couch that in neutral, racially neutral language.
I absolutely agree. I was hoping. Actually, I wanted to ask before we hop into specific parts of your book. I wanted to ask because you said that you benefit from white privilege, but I just wanted to ask, do you think that you consciously and or unconsciously, do you think you participate in mistreating non-white people directly and or indirectly?
That's a really hard question to answer. I don't think I do consciously.
Unconsciously?
It's certainly possible. For me, I think the most difficult issue that I navigate in my life, and I think this is common to professional women and mothers of all races, actually. It's a class and a race issue. Is immigrant, non-white women working as domestic workers to help care for our homes and kids so that we can function as with a job and a family, and trying to figure out how to have those relationships without practicing white supremacy, I think is probably the biggest challenge I face. I'm sure I don't always handle it the best possible way. It's almost impossible, in fact, given the structural situation of people migrating for domestic work and the nature of the work. I think it'd probably be impossible to have a truly, to take it out of the system of white supremacy. But within those constraints, I try to, pay very high wages, et cetera, benefits, treat it as a professional relationship. I think that's very challenging.
We've had lots of white people on the program at this point. I just want to point out, I know it can be difficult, but being as honest as we can bear, as Dr. Robert Jensen said when he was on the program, many white people have come on this program and said that they believe it is absolutely impossible to imagine how you could be a white person in the system of white supremacy and not participate in mistreating non-white people. They just can't even imagine how that would be possible. Even the people who say that they want to work against racism, white supremacy. Tim Wise has been on the program and admitted to being a racist white supremacist. Dr. Martin Kevorkian, who suggested your book, admitted to being a white supremacist. Matthew Jacobson, who authored Whiteness of a Different Color, very similar to your work, he was on the program, also said, just can't imagine what it would be like to be a white person and to not participate in that system in some way. And actually, I want to hop to your book because you give many illustrations. Being a white person means, their definition, and white people have said this explicitly, you participate in mistreating non-white people. From the chapter in your book, you talk about the common sense of race. you illustrate many examples where someone carted off to court during the 19th century, their whiteness in question. And many times this centered around sexual intercourse, very important theme in your book, Controlling Sexual Conduct of Non-White and White People. Many times you talked about how the courts would even decide against a white person if it meant insisting that white people were very aware of who is white, who is not white, and how you're supposed to function with that person. The courts were very resistant to even possibly conceding that a white person could be ignorant about racism, ignorant enough that they could not discriminate between who is white and who is non-white. Could you talk about that aspect of your book for our audience, please?
Sure. So there were this idea, as you said, of a common sense of race. I found to be very closely connected to an idea of performing racial identity, that race is something we know when we see, and or we should know when we see, and we know it through the way people behave. And in particular, that I saw, particularly for men, that was about performing citizenship and acts of citizenship. People who acted like citizens and exercised rights must be white, and if you're white, you deserve those rights of citizenship. So they drew this very strong link between whiteness and citizenship. In cases involving interracial marriage, and in particular in the early 20th century, there a lot of regulation of marriage, and not just in the South, but all over the United States. And sometimes these cases came about because a husband decided he didn't want to pay alimony in a divorce. For example, he could say, my wife was of Negro blood, and therefore my marriage wasn't valid, and I don't owe her anything. Courts at times would even fine for the wife, and at first I thought this was so strange. Why are they fining for you would think the powerful white man would win the case, but I came to realize that these were about bigger stakes than the two people in the case. So even fining for a so-called Negro woman over a so-called white man was okay if it would uphold the larger ideals of white supremacy, that he should have known that he should have had that common sense of race. He should know. We expect white men to understand the way race works. And if he didn't, if he's violated rules, if he's gone and crossed the line, then he'll pay, but we uphold the larger ideals of white supremacy that benefit white men more generally.
I found that very interesting, because you pointed out how it was just said over and over again. You didn't just present one court case, you presented a lot of them where the same idea of, if you're white, you know what a white person is, you know what a non-white person is, and you know how to tell the difference. White people don't get confused about this. That's part of your job as a white person. You're supposed to know this. So you knew, even if you was a non-white person, it doesn't matter. You knew that. You weren't unaware of that. You were very aware that it was not a non-white person. So that's not an excuse to say that you were tricked. Just a total refusal to accept the possibility that a white person could be fooled about the racial classification of an individual, if they're white or non-white.
And a lot of anxiety about what would happen if people were fooled. Would that suggest that persons of color who were passing in their midst were actually more clever than they were, right? Or would it suggest that there's a lot more sex going on than they want to admit? There are a lot of dangers, and I talk about, actually, it goes in two directions, right? One danger is there are black people passing in our midst, and that's really scary. The other is, what if it could go the other way and a white person could be enslaved? What if this could happen to me? And that's a fear that some slaves are able to take advantage of in Suits for Freedom. They can pose that specter of white slavery and say, I'm like you, this could happen to you. And they're able to win their freedom on that basis. But again, only at the price of performing whiteness in a way that conforms to the ideals of white supremacy.
When I read that part of the book, like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and I learned a lot. I repeatedly thanked Dr. Martin Kevorkian. I'm going to email him after the program to thank him. He gave me 2 outstanding books, yours and Professor Ian Haney Lopez. Outstanding. He can suggest anything now. I'll try and get him on the show. Justice, have you thought of some questions that you would like to ask Professor Ariela Gross?
Yes.
Okay.
May you please tell me at least 2 white people you know that practices racism, white supremacy?
I suppose I would have to go with our recent ex-presidents and vice presidents. To me, the most salient practices of white supremacy are those that have been practiced by our government, and the fact that we've been responsible for tens of thousands of deaths of Iraqis in the last 8-9 years is, I think, part of that global system of white supremacy, and I'd have to take that right to the top. So that would probably be my number 1.
Okay, how do you function around non-white people everywhere you go?
So I don't want to sound too, this may sound defensive, but I did come on the show to talk about my book, and honestly, I just don't talk about my personal life on the radio to anybody. So I don't take that personally, but I really don't want to talk about my personal life. So I think that's legitimate, and I'm going to stick with that.
Okay, so that's how you function around non-white people?
I'm sorry?
So that's how you function around non-white people?
That's what I am not going to talk about on the radio. My, personal relations between me and friends or coworkers, not my subject here. So I'm happy to talk about the subject of my book or more generally. And I've talked a bit about myself, but that's just about all I want to talk on a personal level.
Okay.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Do you have some more questions you would like to ask Justice?
Yes. You said you wrote a book, right?
Mhm.
Your book does in your book, does it say white supremacy?
It does.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any more questions.
Okay. We'll come back after you've had some time to think. I wanted to point out early in your book, I thought this was very funny. It probably isn't funny, but I found it very humorous. You pointed out several cases where these people were accepted as white. They may have had various folks in their background, along their family tree who were not white, a grandparent or parent or somewhere along the line who was a non-white person.
Right.
Could have been a so-called Indian or a black person, freed black person or a slave. How their offspring or great-grandchildren somewhere down the line, they would be questioned, whether or not they're a white person would be called into question. And in some cases, you pointed out how if they upset somebody, that's the thing that came out repeatedly. When they upset white people, that was the first thing they would go after. That is a Negro. That's not even a white person. And you even pointed out how there were some cases of slander where, someone would say, oh, that's not even a white person, that's a Negro. The person who that was said about would get angry and take that person to court and say, hey, he's insulted me, he called me a Negro, or implied I wasn't white. Can you talk about some of those cases so people can understand? Because I think that, again, points to the conscious nature of being a white person in the system of white supremacy, what that means, and consciousness of what it means to lose being a white person in the system of white supremacy.
Absolutely. These cases, most of which are middle of the 19th century, but there are slander cases in the early 20th century as well, often involves, I ended up using the term like a racial investigator. I was so struck by the way certain people in a community, these are often in small communities, a neighbor or someone in the community would go out of his way, extraordinarily out of his way, to prove someone had quote-unquote Negro blood. They might travel hundreds of miles to the place where this person came from and take people's depositions and, in a campaign to essentially have someone expelled from the community. And so they often started out with some kind of feud. In some you can see it's really directly about economic competition, like there was one case I found with two grocers, one on a different corner from the other. They're competing for business, and one starts saying, don't go to him, he's got Negro blood. And then there's a slander suit. But sometimes there's a fight, people get mad, and then someone will go on a campaign to prove the other one, quote-unquote, Negro. And so you're absolutely right. I think it shows that, what Cheryl Harris calls that property interest in whiteness. You've really harmed me if you're threatening my white status. Often it means the kids are kicked out of school, the people are lose the right to vote or are pushed out of the community. So it has these very serious consequences. And on the flip side, though, many of these cases involve, as you said, people for whom their black ancestry was not unknown to the other white people in the neighborhood until that point. And in fact, they might be members of these kind of unusual to me before I learned about it, these entire communities of racially ambiguous people. That's what I end up calling them. People used to call them triracial or racial islands, but communities up and down the East Coast who were known to be of either mixed race or not completely white, but were given the privileges of white people, or who were able to claim those privileges for some period of time, as you say, until someone got mad. They had this precarious position, but it's interesting for anyone who wants to say that under Jim Crow it was, a sharp line, all black and white, it is interesting that there were a lot of people who didn't fall on one side of the line and who managed to survive that way for decades into the 20th century and, kind of navigate their way through this very racist landscape.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting. One of the ways that you talk about how people would function at this time when blatant, explicit, very conscious racism, white supremacy, one of the things that white people who practiced racism would do is encourage everyone, white and non-white people. One of the ways you perform whiteness, support the system of white supremacy, and can win white people to your side is by mistreating and distancing yourself from black people. Can you talk about that?
Yes, this is one of the really most, tragic sides of the story is how often, you can see it in part as just a direct divide and conquer strategy by whites to separate different groups of people of color. Also, I think I focus in particular on Indian groups who identify as Indian, and I highlighted, a few case studies that I follow of Indians who have mixed with people of African descent and also whites. There's kind of a big these mixed communities, and they follow very different strategies of how to handle it when their identity is challenged. So there are the Croatans who are known as Croatans in the 19th century. They're now known as the Lumbee. They're still fighting for federal recognition as an Indian tribe, and one of the things they struggle against is that they were considered mixed with Negro and therefore not really Indian. And the Lumbee have claimed an Indian identity very strongly and tried to reject any suggestion that they were black, insisted on a separate school system. So in Jim Crow, North Carolina, there weren't just two schools, black and white, but a third for the Lumbee, so that they wouldn't have to go to school with blacks. So their effort to distance themselves from black people, you have the so-called 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast who actually enslaved African Americans, and although I talked about the Seminole, had a fairly integrated nation in the early years, by the 20th century, they've learned the lesson that to be successful and to gain rights of citizenship, they have to distance themselves. And in fact, both the Seminole Nation and the Cherokee Nation have in the last decade expelled their black citizens from citizenship. It's not a pretty story. And my sort of heroes in the story are the Narragansett of Rhode Island, who all through the 19th century have their tribal identity challenged because they're so mixed. And they're the only ones who keep telling the state of Rhode Island whenever they try to detribalize them. The Narragansett say, we don't want your U.S. citizenship. We don't want your second-class citizenship. We know, yeah, we're mixed, yeah, we're African, but we know that if we become U.S. citizens, we'll be second-class citizens because we're colored. We don't want anything to do with it. So they don't deny, they say we're Indian, but they don't deny their African connections. But they lose. They're detribalized. And so everyone learns that message, that the way to citizenship is to get closer to whiteness, farther from blackness.
That, again, further, I think, illustrates that was another reason I loved your book. I felt like your book evidenced every viewpoint I have about the system of white supremacy that I could really just clown and say exactly what I want, and then flip through the pages of your book to say, yep, this is why I'm saying dedicated to the system of white supremacy, because you point out clear examples where it is explicitly demonstrated to everyone, to where even the non-white people are understanding, oh, okay, the way this system works, mistreat non-white people, especially black people. Got it. If you don't do that, you will get in trouble. Bad things will happen to you, white or non-white. If you don't do that, bad things will happen to you. I'm making it very simple, but that's pretty much what you articulated in your book. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I wanted to point out, because I learned a lot reading your book, the Seminole tribe. I had no idea there were so many black people who participated in the Seminole tribe. Can you talk about that experience? And they too encountered a lot of mistreatment as a result of that. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I mentioned that there were 5 nations in the Southeast that were known as the 5 civilized tribes. They were the Seminole, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek. And of all of these, the Seminoles were in Florida, and they were really came together as a collection of the remnants of other tribes. There was no original Seminole grouping going back to Aboriginal times, but after European contact, they form a tribe out of sort of people who are left over after the devastation of disease and wars, and among the people who come together are runaway slaves who have escaped as far south as they can from this is in Spanish Florida. They're essentially maroon communities of runaway slaves who apparently kind of partner with these groups of Indians, so they're in the same nation. When the other 4 nations develop slavery, they start enslaving blacks. The Seminoles develop a form of slavery too, but it's not. It looks quite different from slavery among whites or even the Cherokee. It's these maroon communities will sort of pay a tax to the Indians, but they'll more or less live on their own. And there were also many black Seminoles, or they were actually known as Estelesti, who had positions of power within the Seminole Nation. There were military leaders and interpreters, and they spoke the Seminole language. So it's quite different from the Cherokee, who try to become more like the surrounding white society and actually develop plantation slavery. So I use those 2 tribes because I think they start from very different points in terms of the place of blacks in the nation. But then the Trail of Tears, the Indian tribes are removed to what's now Oklahoma. It's then Indian Territory. And after the Civil War, they all sign treaties with the United States that say, adopt your freedmen, your freed slaves as citizens. And, even at the time, some of the Seminoles say, what do you mean adopt? We're already in one of the family. What do you mean adopt as citizens? But they're treated as though they were outsiders who were incorporated. And now anyone, whether they were free, whether they were descended from military leaders, or whether they were slaves, are called freedmen. And when it really starts to break down is at the turn of the 20th century, when the U.S. adopts this policy of allotment of land. They say we're going to break up tribal governments, break up tribal lands, give little individual allotments to individual Indians, make them U.S. citizens. All the leftover land is for us. So it's a big land grab. It's just a big land grab, but it goes with this ideology of now you get to be individual U.S. citizens and you're not Indians anymore. And they, in order to do those land allotments, they have to write everybody down on an Indian roll. When they go around with these, they kind of set up tents in each town to take rolls. They say Congress says, well, you can't separate the Seminoles out because the Seminoles are just too mixed up. For every other tribe, you can do a freedman roll for blacks, and you can do an Indian roll. But you can't do it for the Seminoles. They're too mixed up. And the commission writes back and they say, well, we're so proud of ourselves, we segregated the Seminoles too. So they break people up and they arbitrarily assign them. You're black, you're Indian, you're black, you're Indian. and from then on, that identity that's written down on those rolls has had enormous consequences for people who are descended in the Seminole Nation, because people who are identified as black are now it's the state of Oklahoma. They're excluded from schools. They're excluded from all public places. They're subject to Jim Crow. Indians are defined as white people in Oklahoma, so they get white privileges. And today, when finally the Seminole Nation wins its land claim against the federal government for the land that was stolen back in 1823, and the government decided, in agreement with the Seminole Nation, that the black Seminoles shouldn't share in that money because they weren't citizens back in 1823. They were slaves. So the Seminole freedmen have really suffered. And the only bright spot, actually, in the story is that the black Cherokee, who faced a very similar situation, took their case, instead of taking it to the U.S. federal court, they took their case to the Cherokee Supreme Court and won in the Cherokee Supreme Court. And then the next chapter is that the rest of the Cherokee got together and changed their constitution to exclude them again. So that's still an ongoing battle, but it's happening right now. So it is a kind of shocking story that a lot of people didn't even know that Indians had black slaves. So
a lot of this information was very new to me. I will say it's not shocking if you understand racism, white supremacy, if you understand, hey, you want to mess up your chances for doing well, be nice to black people, associate with black people. And that's what you evidence in your book. I mean, it's very true, and I already concluded that before I read your book. I just didn't know that there was tons of information and evidence to support exactly what I'm saying. System of white supremacy, you want to do well, you want white people to give you more privileges and not mistreat you, distance yourself from and mistreat black people. Not doing that, probably going to be getting more treatment yourself. And you evidence how this happened with both white people and non-white people. Justice, did you have some questions you would like to ask Professor Ariela Groves?
Yes.
Okay.
What do you do when you are around white people who practice racism, white supremacy?
Try to call them on it.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm still there, but again, as I said, I'm sorry. It's not very likely I'm going to have anything too illuminating to say on those personal questions.
Okay.
Do you have some other questions?
What?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Why is everywhere I go, I hear and see white people in every media Why is that? Why not so many non-white people on those things?
My understanding of that probably isn't a lot deeper than yours. I think the media are dominated by white people, and they produce the shows that they think other white people are going to want to watch, and that's why they dominate most of the entertainment and media. So, again, it's not at all my area of expertise, but I think it's just pretty straightforward. They go where the money is and where their own interest is, and because they're run by white people, they perpetuate that.
Okay. I'll take a few more questions. Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Justice and Gus T Renegade on the cows with University of Southern California Professor Ariela Gross. One of the consistent things that I focus on in studying racism, white supremacy, is sexual conduct between white people and non-white people, and that is all over your book. Sexual intercourse between white people and non-white people, frequently with white people being concerned that having too much of this will create confusion. We'll end up having people that we will have a very hard time being able to pick out if they're white or not. We might even make mistakes and treat a non-white person as a white person, and that would be horrible. Or even worse yet, we might have a white person that we mistakenly identify as a non-white person, and that would be terrible to subject a white person to all the things that we do to dark people. Also, in the whole eugenics movement that you talk about with Madison Grant, this is early 20th century, having too much sexual intercourse between white people and non-white people, it'll be terrible. Their offspring are just imbeciles. You talk about with Filipino men. Many people came out explicitly, we can't have this. They tend to end up with feeble-minded white women and just have ignorant offspring that are just going to be drains on society. I feel your book explicitly evidences how one of the central objectives of maintaining the system of white supremacy is control of sexual conduct of non-white people and white people. Do you think that's accurate? And I feel like you point that out a lot in your book. If you do think it's accurate, you could share some of the details that you talk about in your book.
I do. I think you're absolutely right. The concern with sexuality has a few dimensions. One is about the fear about the children who will be, in the words of someone like Madison Grant, the fear of mongrelization of the white race, that fear. There's also, I think, just anxiety and hysteria about sex itself, which, of course, has its most horrible incarnation in the lynching movement in the U.S. South and West, where the specter of a black man raping or having consensual sex with a white woman becomes this excuse and rallying cry for murder of black men and also women and also white men who have anything to do with black men. I mean, many people who become victims in this hysteria. But the third thing dimension that I think is important, and I didn't really realize as much till I started working on this, is how much of the concern is focused on marriage rather than sex. That in fact most regulations before the 1870s or so, during the slavery period, were about marriage rather than sex, or what they called fornication, and that's really about property and legitimacy, right? It's not just we're afraid that people will be having sex with each other, because they were fine with white men having sex with black women, right, with masters having sexual access to their slaves. That was okay, as so long as the status of children followed the mother. But marriage threatened the system of property, and marriage across the so-called color line threatened property and threatened to make people of color legitimate citizens. And so I was actually surprised to learn how much regulation was aimed at marriage and not just sex, or not even at sex at all for many years, but marriage.
I feel I have seen a lot of the same thing, and I have said consistently exactly what you just said. White people have shown the ability, both Thomas Jefferson, if you want to go more current day, Strom Thurmond, and many others, I'm sure, they have shown a consistent ability to practice racism, white supremacy, and have sexual intercourse with non-white people, even having children with non-white people. Those two things are not incompatible at all. They seem staunchly against the marriage thing because, exactly as you just said, I think that that implies, wait a minute, now you're not exactly treating this non-white person as a subordinate. You're treating this person like an equal. You don't marry someone who's supposed to be lesser than you. And as a result of all that, I have concluded it would be very constructive if non-white people discontinued sexual intercourse with white people as long as the system of white supremacy exists. And I have seen white people generally are very upset about this, don't like it at all. Even the ones who say that they do see the logic in why a non-white person would say that, adamantly opposed to it. Do you think that would be a successful way to work against racism, white supremacy?
I don't know. I certainly see. I'll probably sound like like a lot of white people you've spoken to in saying I can see why you would say that. I have to think about that. I certainly have friends who have that view. So I've heard.
You have friends who have that view, non-white people.
Heard that view. Yeah, I've heard who have voiced that view, and I see where it comes from. I think it's easier probably to relate to that view than a completely separatist one about all kinds of relationships. But I have to say that, as a matter of ideology, I'm an integrationist. I hope my kids, will have relationships with non-white, white people and white people, and will have a more integrated life than my generation. And so, as a hope and a dream, mine is probably closer to the beloved community. And, that might make me hopelessly old-fashioned, but in terms of that level. But I think the politics of sexuality are really tough, and they're very gendered. I think the black-white marriage in the U.S. is very uncommon, but black men, white women, much more common than the other way around. And there are political reasons for each of these versions of a couple, but in any incarnation, black-white marriage is much less common than Latino black, Latino white, Asian white. Every other combination has become much more common and accepted. Has that led to less, white supremacy? The fact that there continues to be much less black-white marriage? I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure it's an effective strategy.
Again, that's why I said non-white people, not just black people, non-white people, and I said no sexual intercourse, not marriage. I see a ton of evidence that non-white people and white people have been having lots and lots and lots of sexual intercourse for the duration of white supremacy. I am not aware of, at any point, non-white people, a significant number of them, saying, we are in a system of white supremacy and we think it would be constructive to try discontinuing sexual intercourse with white people to see if that will be something that will help us make some progress on replacing this with a system of justice. I'm not aware of that. And in fact, what I have seen is it creates a lot of confusion. The same thing that you evidence in your book about during the 19th century, white people didn't want a whole lot of this marriage and sex stuff with non-white people because it could lead to confusion about racial classifications. I see that now, but the non-white people get confused about racial classifications in saying, well, I don't know, I'm so-called multiracial, and I love your book. You talk about just the use of the term race itself, how white supremacists have used this term to further confuse people about what race means, who is so-called a part of the Hawaiian race, when they became a race in the first place. This whole blood quantum thing, I think I see all of that playing out with so-called multiracial offspring who have a white parent, non-white parent. They end up being very confused about racism, white supremacy, thinking that they are a white person and a so-called Latino, a so-called Asian person. I see that confusion playing out, so I think it would cut down on a lot of that. I was hoping, I know I've just said a lot, I was hoping we can start breaking a little bit of that down. Can you talk about what I just said in terms of the confusion where you point out in your book, white people, most likely racists, would go amongst non-white people and at certain points decide that this is a race. You all are a race of people. They did this in both Hawaii. They did this with Native Americans. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, hang on. Excuse me. My phone is running out of battery.
Uh-oh.
And of course my children have hid the other phone. Telephone. So in Hawaii, I guess I'll say something about blood quantum among Indians first. That notion that people should be described in terms of fractions of blood, fractions of Indian blood, becomes important after that process of allotment I talked about, where everybody gets written down on these rolls, and then they say, they create laws that say, well, we should have different rules for people of different fractions of blood, because people who are full-blood Indians are very childlike and backwards and need to be protected, so we shouldn't allow them to sell their land. But people who are only half-blood can sell their land. Those laws restricting sales of land actually ended up being pretty helpful to some Indians because there was so much theft of land and graft and fraud that people who were restricted were more able to hold on to their land. And so a lot of people end up in court saying, I should have been restricted, which is kind of a funny argument to make in court. But in any case, today, Indians walk around with a card called Certificate of Degree of Indian Blood, and those cards, which certify them as Indian, go back to the rolls from 100 years ago and say, what fraction did you have your ancestor have 100 years ago? What fraction do you have today? They pin down this arbitrary fraction and to decide who is or isn't an Indian, even though that definition didn't come from Indian nations themselves. They came from the U.S. government. And in Hawaii, it's even more blatant that blood quantum goes together with this process of allotting land to individual Indians and grabbing most of the land for, in Hawaii, it's the sugar companies and the ranches. And they're very explicit. They have these debates where they say, what should count as a Native Hawaiian? Well, if we say it's 1/32 degree of blood, that would be a lot of Native Hawaiians and less land for us. But if we say it's 50%, that would be fewer Native Hawaiians and more land for sugar companies. And it's pretty explicit. I mean, they don't. That was maybe a little more literal than they did, but not much. So very clear connection between taking the land and limiting people's ability to identify by this notion of blood. And now Hawaiians are again suffering from this because the Supreme Court came in and said, oh, look, you're defined by blood. You're a race. You're not a sovereign people who had their land stolen from them. You're just another racial group. And so all these institutions that have been set up to take care of the land that we took from you, that we actually admitted that we stole from you, no, you don't get to administer those institutions. Any white person in Hawaii should be able to be part of that as well. So the whole idea of blood is really something that's been used against people of color.
Would it be accurate to say the whole idea of the term race has been something that has been used against non-white people and to support?
And I argue that it was created to subordinate people of color. So yes, absolutely. Hello?
Why do you not want to share how you function around non-white people?
Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Gus, you're cutting off a little bit.
My telephone.
I can't. White people.
Did you hear the question, Professor Gross?
No, I'm having trouble hearing.
Okay. She said, she asked, why did you not want to share how you function around non-white people?
I don't have a working telephone. So it's a very general question. It's a question of my personal interactions with friends and coworkers, and because of that, it doesn't seem appropriate to me for a discussion about my book and the historical research that I do. So I feel a little bit put on the spot to talk about those personal interactions publicly. Just that's not what I do. So I appreciate where that question is coming from, but I'm not going to talk about it.
Why do you not want to talk about it?
Sweetheart, I don't want to sound patronizing, but if you want to talk about your personal life publicly, you can do that. But I don't do that. I go on the radio because I want to talk about issues and because I care about these issues, but I'm not talking about my personal life in public.
Okay.
I don't do that.
Okay.
I don't know if I can be any more clear on that subject.
You're fine. I understand. do you talk about white supremacy around your non-white friends and other non-white people?
Since I'm a historian of race, and I talk about it all the time, that's, yes.
Oh, what?
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have any questions right now.
Okay. I want to get one of the callers in case anything happens. Someone called in. I can't see your area code, but if you called in and you had a question, you should be on live. If you have a question you'd like to ask Professor Gross.
What's up, victims of white people?
I couldn't hear the question, I'm sorry.
A victim, can you hear me?
Yes, now I do.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening.
Professor Gross. I have a question for you. I also have a question for the victims on this show. When the victim, the host of this show, asked you whether or not you thought it was appropriate for white people and non-white people to have sexual relations while the system of white supremacy exists, and you gave the answer that you were somewhat old-fashioned, and you were also speaking of your dreams regarding your children, and that you desired that they would have relations and relationships with non-white people, and also that when you told us that your children had hidden the telephone, was that personal or was that about your book?
That was inadvertent because I'm making this call from home and my phone is running out of battery. So probably inappropriate, but inadvertent.
I'm sorry, I didn't get an answer to my question. Was that personal or was that about your book?
Yes, so probably personal, but yes.
Okay. I also had another question. A victim, are you there?
Yes, I can hear you, sir.
I have a question for you before I ask Professor Gross another question. Are you doing this show with hopes that it will be constructive?
That is the plan with every show, sir. Yes, sir. I don't say that I accomplish that every time out, but I try.
Are you doing it so that constructivity will be an end in itself, or is it a means to an end?
The purpose of the show is to share constructive information that will assist in the replacement of white supremacy. That is the ultimate goal. So if the constructiveness would have to be measured against, does it support replacing white supremacy with justice? That's how it would measure its constructiveness.
Great. Professor Gross, were you aware of the victim's ultimate purpose for doing this show before you came on the show?
In a general way, yes.
In a general way? Oh, and I have another question. You said that you came on this show to discuss your book. What is the purpose of for writing the book, and why did you come on the show to discuss your book?
I think my purpose is actually quite similar to Gus's, I hope, although I should say I do it as a historian. I hope that understanding better the history of this country will help us, and a history of white supremacy will help us better to figure out how to replace it, white supremacy, with justice. So I'm echoing his words. But I come on to talk as a historian and not to talk about my personal life. If that's what you were getting at, I'm not sure.
I have one other question for you right now. When during the course of this show, and particularly at the beginning, and keeping in mind what you said about the purpose of your book, the victim of this show asked you a question. Well, you said that you disagreed with him having the word dedicated in his definition of the system of white supremacy. You also were uncertain or seemed confused or disagreed with him about whether white people are conscious or unconscious about practicing this. You also disagreed or had some reluctance about saying whether or not your privilege had anything to do with mistreating people. Now, up until the point where he exposed you and caught you with each and every one of those three areas, if it had been white people who weren't as savvy in questioning you, if it had been non-white people who weren't as savvy as this victim in questioning you, then they would have been further confused, which is ultimately definitely mistreatment of non-white people. As that goes, and then you completely turned your story around. So in terms of what you say about the purpose of your book and coming on this show, why should I believe a single word of what you're saying?
Well, I guess all I can suggest is to read it. That's really, I hope the book can do that, and if I'm not going to convince you in person, I think maybe the work will. And I also want to say I don't think I ever said I was disagreeing with Gus's definition, but raising a concern about it being the exclusive. So he had a global definition for what does white supremacy encompass, and I think when you're coming up with, for one thing, historians usually don't do global definitions. They're all about this particularity and this place and this time, and we're not the big global definers. But if you're going to do it, I want a definition that encompasses both kinds of, all the different kinds of ways that white supremacy can operate. And I do want to encompass both conscious and unconscious ways. And I think that we make a big mistake when we limit ourselves to talking about racism I don't want to minimize the importance of personal level interactions, but I think we're missing something big if that's what we focus on. I think too much of contemporary talking about race focuses on the personal injury and the psychological injuries of those interactions instead of, and misses the big picture of this, what the state does to govern us in a white supremacist way every day. And I think that's why I'm a historian of law, because I think those institutions and the state really matter. And so I don't want to deny the importance of those personal interactions, but I just don't want to miss the point that there's other stuff that goes on that structures everything we do that doesn't involve personal choices all the time. And I also, you want to say change my tune or turned around. I listened to what Gus said. I hope the point of conversation is listening. And he convinced me to modify what I first said, because he was right. He reminded me of some things that I do believe, but I hadn't stated as well as I should have. And one of those is to say that, yes, there's lots and lots of evidence of conscious, dedicated racism. But I also think, as a historian, one of the things I want to try to show is what happens when you turn that, when even after there's been some change in individual hearts and minds, but the structures and institutions haven't changed and they're still there. And I think that there has been some change in many, and not all, individual hearts and minds, and yet we're still here with a system of deep inequality and subordination. So that's what I was trying to get across.
I want 720, if you can hang tight. I wanted to make sure Justice wasn't missing out on questions. I did want to point out, because she said that as a historian, they tend not to focus on the global picture. They try to get at the subtle idiosyncrasies that exist when you make an analysis as you move from region to region, time period to time period, so on and so forth. I feel that the staggering thing when you start analyzing the system of white supremacy, whether you're talking 1805, 1850, 1905, 2005, 2009, no matter what part of the globe you are on, white supremacy would be the most dominant force on the planet amongst people by far. I think that is one thing I would want to ask to make sure we're on the same page. Do you think that is a true statement, what I just said?
Yes.
Okay.
But
very important. Hold on, because it's important. Wait a minute. I want to let you finish your statement. Again, as I said, this program, non-white people tend not to understand that. Sometimes it's good to just let that sit with them for a minute to understand what I just said. Over the last at least 200 years, and who knows, could be longer than that, 1805, 1850, 1905, 2005, 2009, regardless of where you are on the planet, the most dominant force amongst people would be the system of white supremacy. And you said that is true, correct?
Yes, but okay. I guess I would also, I would say two things about that. One is, once we've said that, I really want to know as a historian that, how and where and when, all of that other stuff, because I don't want to homogenize the whole, it's all the same everywhere, every time. And one reason I don't want to do that is because many people, once they say it's that way everywhere all the time, jump to their next step is, maybe it's just human nature and there's nothing we can do about it. I hear that all the time. This is just the way people are ethnocentric, and whoever's on top is just going to feel that way, and it's never going to change, and there's nothing that can be done about it.
I completely respect what you just said, and both in terms of understanding, even though white supremacy is everywhere, it operates a little differently. As you move around the globe, you'll see idiosyncrasies in how white supremacy is practiced, but the dominant overall theme worldwide, white over non-white, you will see that play out everywhere. And I do think it's important to pick up on how it's practiced a little differently in the area of the world known as Brazil, as opposed to here in the United States, as opposed to South Africa, as opposed to Australia. Definitely you'll pick up different things on subtle, idiosyncrasies along the way. I also want to point out, let me see, you had one other point I wanted to, I do not hear non-white people who evidence that they have that sort of understanding of white supremacy. Most of the non-white people I know do not have Shel Harris's level of expertise, do not have your level of expertise in the scope of white supremacy and how much you obviously you read a lot of material to compile your book. I'm sure Professor Harris at UCLA, I'm sure she's read a lot of material to publish her work. Most non-white people I know don't have that understanding. So when they say, yeah, white people in charge, what are you going to do? Most of them don't have your level of understanding. I think once you start to get a better understanding of white supremacy, you start to understand ways that you can work against that system, and I hope that's what's happening on this program. As non-white people become more informed about how this system works, they'll have a better idea of working against that system, because even though I believe white supremacy by far is the most dominant force on the planet, I do believe it can be corrected. If I didn't, we would not be having this discussion. I would be doing drugs, and I wouldn't care anything about your book. I'd be doing drugs and trying to get a white woman so I could insulate myself from racism. That's the second time I've had to say that this week, so I don't think you can... I think it's healthy to respect the dominance that white people have established worldwide in this system, and at the same time that will aid you in taking that dominant system apart.
Yes.
Justice, did you have some questions you would like to ask?
Why are you laughing?
Why was I laughing just then? I thought Gus was amusing in acknowledging. He was wryly acknowledging that, you know, if he didn't think there was any way to do something about this, he could just be, you know, kicking back and doing all kinds of other things. That this is actually hard work. So I thought that was funny. Not hysterically funny, but amusing.
Okay, and does your book talk about education?
Well, only in the sense that I talk about a lot of cases that are about whether kids can go to school together, and who's going to be allowed into the good schools or kept out of the good schools. And those are cases that people fought really hard over, because it wasn't just a question of kids going to school together, but whether all kids would be allowed to go to the good schools, and the good schools were always the white schools, and that's why people cared about it a lot.
Book does not talk about education. Yes or no?
But I don't talk about what happens in school.
So that would have been a yes, it does talk about education?
So I said, no, I don't talk about what happens in school, which would be, I suppose, talking about education.
I'm not talking about school. I'm talking about education.
Education outside of school, how people learn the things they know. I guess I'm wondering what you mean by education, not in school.
Like,
do you have something particular in mind when you're thinking about education?
Like math, reading, like things that you learn.
Oh, okay. Not
everywhere you go.
Not really, no.
Okay. I don't have any more right now.
Oh, okay. I had a question, and I'm going to see if 720 if he has a question. If you would like to call in, if you would like to ask Professor Gross questions about her book, lots of good information there. The number is 347-215-6071. Professor at the University of Southern California. I wanted to get back on the sexual intercourse thing, because I do think that's very important. And as I said, I feel it would be very important. It would clear up a lot of confusion amongst non-whites, because I think the same thing that happened, that white people didn't want to happen, having sexual intercourse with non-white people, creating confusion amongst them about how to classify people racially. I think the same thing happens now with non-white people, where we get confused. And actually can evidence this program. I have heard non-white people argue vehemently amongst themselves about President Obama. Is he a black person? Is he so-called multiracial person? Is he really a black person? I have heard tons of heated discussions about this. You earlier on in this program displayed no confusion at all. You said he is a black person, end of story. I'm pretty certain, I don't know, but I suspect you know he has a white parent. That didn't cause any confusion for you at all. He's a black person moving forward. You didn't express any suspicion about that at all. And you're a white person. As a non-white...
I take the way he identifies himself, and I think Barack Obama has always identified himself as black and made a conscious political choice to do so. And so I refer to him the way he talks about himself. But I think the fact that he has a white mother I thought race played out in some very interesting ways in the campaign. One way that it played out in the campaign, and we really see it now, are the ways, and this is, I think, probably the most salient way. I talked about the common sense of race drawing the connections between whiteness and citizenship. The people who wanted to discredit Barack Obama painted him as a non-white, non-citizen. Right? He was, Barack Hussein Obama. He's a Muslim. That was always the rumor, although it's not true. Lately, in an effort to discredit him, now he's president, are all kinds of rumors that he's actually born in Indonesia and isn't a citizen at all. There's this whole movement of people who want him to produce his birth certificate. They're known as the birthers, apparently. Again, he's not legitimate. He's not white. He's not a citizen. So that's, I think, one of the most salient undercurrents in the discussion of race. The other is the ways that his campaign had to try to navigate to make him non-threatening as a person of color. And I think this has nothing to do with, leaving aside questions of what is he really, which, as you say, conversations people love to have. Just the way that the campaign had to try to him so as to be understood as a person of color, but not a threatening black man, not somebody who's angry, and somebody who's comfortable with white people. They always tried to place white people standing behind him. A lot at press conferences, a lot of pictures of him with his white family, his white pictures of him as a child with his white grandmother. Those were efforts to portray someone who is not threatening to white people, and not to argue, not to claim him as multiracial, which might be threatening in a different way to some people, right? I think race played out in a number of different ways, but really, I think by far the most salient is that the effort to discredit him is about connecting his non-whiteness to non-citizenship.
I think President Obama also has been required repeatedly to distance himself from and mistreat black people, both Jeremiah Wright, Louis Farrakhan. He was called on to publicly distance himself from these particular black people. and also the conference on racism earlier this year, he was, again, wheeled out and required to publicly distance himself from this conference. No, I don't think this is something we should get involved in. And even when former President Jimmy Carter came out and said, oh, yeah, he's a victim of racism, these white people that are all upset and everything, this is racism, he was again required to come out.
He was required to come forward and say, oh, no, I don't think it's racism, even though it's pretty clear. And when even Maureen Dowd said oh, you know it, that it is. But
do you think it's racism?
He's been that's been demanded of him. I'll also note that the one time that he did come forward, right, when Henry Louis Gates was the victim of racial profiling in his own home, and President Obama was at a news conference and answered a question about it. He had to backtrack and apologize and have a beer with the guy who did it. I mean, it was painful, the whole thing. But, just for saying really the mildest statement of things that everyone knows or should know about race and policing in this country. So, yes, it is. I mean, the hope that his election would allow for a more open conversation about race and white supremacy. Maybe it's opened up some possibilities, but it's also required so much dancing around for him. He's in such a difficult position.
He's a non-white person. That's to be expected. I think. I tell you the most.
Headline in after the election, there was a headline in the Onion newspaper that said, "Black man gets worst job in country." Wow, that's wow. I will tell you the most shameful thing. I want to check to see if 720 has any more questions. I will tell you the most shameful thing that I saw during that whole, they called it Beergate with Professor Gates and the police officer, enforcement official. They went to Juan Williams, who is a non-white person. He works at NPR. I believe he's a non-white person. They got him and they got Bill Cosby to come out and say, oh, this was terrible. President Obama shouldn't have said this. I can't believe he said this. And I stopped and I thought, I have never heard the press run to get Bill Cosby to comment on what he thought about what the president said about anything. I was just stunned. I mean, it's no disrespect to Bill Cosby. He's probably a lot more informed than me. He certainly has a lot more money than I'll ever have in 20 lifetimes. But I could not grasp, why is his perspective that important that we need to track him down to see what he thinks about President Obama making this comment about what happened up at Harvard. I couldn't imagine that happening if it had been President Bush in the White House and he had said anything. I couldn't imagine them running to Bill Cosby's house saying, Mr. Cosby, what did you think about President Bush's commentary? I could be wrong. I don't know. 720, did you have a question, comment you would like to ask Professor Gross?
Yes, Victim, I do have one comment. I think the show has been extremely constructive once again, and my tally for the white guests that you've had on your show, and what it has shown me is that when push comes to shove, once again, nothing will they ever do to change anything about this system. Thank you. Oh, I am confused, as ever, and particularly about one thing. When the white guests who do come on this show purporting or alleging that they are going to, their purpose is to replace white supremacy with justice, and ultimately it isn't done. I am confused ultimately about what their real purpose is in doing what they are alleging and saying they are doing. But thank you, Professor Gross.
You're welcome, I guess.
Do you think that's a logical...
As a spy?
I didn't hear what you said. I'm sorry.
I'm wondering if the caller thinks I'm here as a spy for the...
The caller thinks he is extremely confused about what exactly you are here for, and the way the caller would think even more clearly would be for the person that is confusing him to tell him exactly what the person is here for.
I'm not sure I can be any more clear than I've tried to be. I wrote history about race, tried to come and talk about that history of white supremacy. I don't have a lot of prescriptions about how to get from here to a place of more justice and less white supremacy, but I do hope that understanding better how we got here will help us to get there. That's what I try to do in my daily life, and certainly what I try to do in my work. That, like, as Gus said, it would be impossible for me not to be in some way part of that system. It doesn't mean that I can't try in whatever way I can to do research and write and work, talk about the issue that we're all discussing. I don't know what else I can say about that.
Professor Gross, you said in whatever way you can? Is that what you said?
I probably said that. Yeah.
Oh, you probably said that. Was there another part you were going to add on to that?
Myself for your suggestions.
You probably said that. Oh, I see. You probably said that. Oh, I see. Okay. Well, Professor,
I feel as though there's a suggestion of, well, certainly with the language of victim, that there's something more else you want me to say or do, and if there is, maybe you can come right out and say what it is.
Okay, I'll do that. I simply want you to tell the truth. I think that's part of the victim's purpose on this show, too. No more, no less.
I'm sorry, I missed the last thing you said.
I said, yes, there is something I want you to do, and I can be straight up with no chaser. Simply tell the truth.
That's what I try to do.
Would you say it's logical for non-white people to be suspicious of white people and to suspect that they could, their ultimate purpose could be to continue practicing racism, white supremacy? Would that be logical for non-white people to think that way?
I think that's perfectly logical.
Okay.
But I also think it would not be particularly logical for someone who wanted to do that to spend 2 hours of their evening and family time coming on this show, because it's hard for me to imagine how they could further that goal this way. That's all.
I know a lot of admitted white supremacists have told me that they have listened to this program. Some of them have even come on the program. I suspect that one thing they could be doing is studying to see how informed non-white people are about the system of white supremacy if their knowledge is getting to the point of being able to threaten the system of white supremacy. I think that's one objective, and I also think another objective could be to insert confusion into the discussion. I think that's another thing a white supremacist could do in coming on this program. They can learn what the non-white people know and see if they can insert confusion to disrupt their knowledge if they are doing anything constructive. Do you think that's something that a white person could do if they wanted to come on the program and still practice racism?
It's possible, but something tells me that there are better ways to do that. But it's possible.
Okay. Before we wrap up, I wanted to check. There was one more person who called in. They slipped under the radar. I cannot see your number, but if you know you called in and you have not said anything, if you have a question or comment, you are live if you'd like to say anything.
Oh, no, I don't have a question. I just listening.
Oh, no problem. No problem. Justice, before we wrap up, did you have questions you would like to ask before we wrap up? Uh-oh. Justice, are you there? Did we lose Justice?
Hello?
Oh, okay. We can hear you. We can hear you. Did you have a question before we wrap up? Questions?
Yes. I do have a comment. Thanks for the information. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. It was fun.
That's all I have.
Oh, okay. I did want to ask because there's a chat room attached to this program, and there have been quite a few people in the chat room, and they felt that in a discussion of racism, white supremacy, that asking a white person about how they conduct themselves with non-white people, that's important information. I just wanted to be clear. The questions that Justice asked that you felt were about your personal life, you think those are appropriate questions to ask, even though you didn't want to answer them on the radio program. You don't see anything incorrect about a non-white person asking those questions under a system of white supremacy.
No, I don't. I don't think it was. I understand why she asked the question. I don't think it's wrong to ask the question, but I also think it's legitimate to make decisions about, you know, what you should do and don't choose to talk about in a very public forum on the radio. Right? And I think I wouldn't be the only person who would make that choice.
Understood. Do you think it would be logical for a victim of white supremacy, a non-white person, to suspect that that's one way you could be practicing racism, white supremacy, by not revealing constructive information? Possibly.
It's certainly possible.
Okay. I appreciate the honesty. The people in the chat room, I would agree. They said that they felt that was one way that you could have been practicing racism, white supremacy on the program in not answering Justice's questions about how you function around non-white people, which I do think is very important information for victims of racism, white supremacy. Again, this is University of Southern. Every time I think about you, I think of O.J. Simpson. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. University of Southern California, Professor Ariela Gross. Her book is What Blood Won't Tell. She actually has written another book. When I first contacted her, I told her we might be auditioning for 2 shows because her other book looks very interesting. Before we go, if you could tell us real quick your other book, what it's about, name of it, so because that might be 2 books we want to check out.
It's called Double Character, Slavery and Mastery in the Antebellum Southern Courtroom, and that's the book that looks at kind of the everyday law and culture of slavery, and in particular on the marketplace for slaves. I really focus on the way slavery is the cornerstone of the Southern economy, and the slave market is a central institution in the American South, and because the marketplace was such a central institution, the courthouse was as well. So I'm looking at the local trials where people worked out the day-to-day life of slavery.
What's the name of that book again?
Double Character, Slavery and Mastery in the Antebellum Southern Courtroom.
Outstanding. I'm telling everyone this is, I have not read that one, but I did read What Blood Won't Tell. I learned a ton, all the information that she talks about, what she shared on the program about different Native American tribes, their relationship with black people, how they ultimately distanced themselves from black people, the whole blood quantum and the importance that took on really was another way that white people mistreated Native Americans, and the whole concept of race, how that was used to mistreat non-white people worldwide. I just learned a ton reading her book. Very constructive. What Blood Won't Tell. Martin Kevorkian is 2 for 2. Outstanding guests he has recommended for the cows. First was Professor Ian Haney Lopez, and tonight our guest from University of Southern California, Professor Ariela. Thank you a lot for coming and speaking with us on the program, and I suspect I'll be checking out your other book.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Have an excellent evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. 2
programs today snuck in there. That was totally random with Mr. Fuller. I was with Yellow Manny, just sitting idly. I didn't even realize that I had the equipment that I could do a show until pretty late, and I just thought, I'll see if Mr. Fuller's in. He happened to be, and I think that was a great program. I generally don't say that about any of the shows that I do, but I think that was a great program. Gay Mentor, if you're listening, thank you for calling in. I felt that was a brilliant live demonstration of exactly what we had been talking about. There were 3 non-white people on the phone. The only person who was happy was the person who admitted to being engaged in so-called homosexual activity. Apparently she doesn't have as much of a problem with racism, white supremacy. Pretty much exactly what we were saying. Check that out. That program wasn't advertised or anything, so might have to do some word of mouth to let people know that Mr. Fuller was here to check out that program. You could download it and listen to it online, what have you. 720, did you have any thoughts you wanted to say before we get ready to sign out?
Thank you, Victim. Thank you, as always. Outstanding.
Right on.
Justice. Thank you so much. Thank you. Outstanding.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you so very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Groovy. I'm glad you were able to call in, 720, loyal supporter. I hope the programs are worthy of your time and energy, and constructive, again, measuring that by our ability to work effectively against the system of white supremacy. Justice, did you want to either tell them your email address or anything else before we sign out?
Yes, I would like to tell my email address. It's justice.asap@yahoo.com.
Outstanding. One more time, justice.asap@yahoo.com. If you want to hit Justice, share anything with her about her performance on the cows. Excellent job again. Do you have any thoughts on today's program, Justice, about our guest, Professor Gross? If you thought she was practicing racism, or if you thought she shared anything constructive, or both?
I didn't really prefer how she was laughing. Really. I mean, we are victims, so I wouldn't really prefer her, anybody laughing.
That was a good catch. I think I laughed a little bit, too. I have acknowledged that I have a tendency to snicker at times when I probably shouldn't be. Probably should be a little more codified and not laughing. I know I had to catch myself several times during the previous program with Mr. Fuller earlier this evening. There were several spots where I had to mute the phone because I was laughing and probably was not constructive. So I'll try and be better about that myself, to not laugh. This is serious, and lots of us are being mistreated, so we should not be snickering about this issue. Did you think she was practicing racism on the show? Do you think she could have been?
I don't know, really.
I think she could have been. Especially around your questions where she said that was personal. I think she could have been practicing racism there. And I definitely think initially in her saying that, in fact, all of the white people who have said, well, I don't think white people do it consciously, I think that's an act of racism, a conscious act of racism. I suspect it is, because my definition doesn't say anything about racism being conscious or unconscious. It just says that the people who say they're white are dedicated to maintaining the system of white supremacy. The white people who practice racism, they are dedicated to maintaining that system. And what Blood Won't Tell, Professor Gross's book, evidences that, which he shared with us on this program. I hope it was constructive. I want to thank Back of the Bus for his continued support. Please check his blog out, nonwhitealliance.wordpress.com. Very constructive information. Also want to thank Non-Mighty Wick, consistent assistance with the cows. Very helpful. Please join the Facebook group. All you have to do if you're listening at Blog Talk Radio, click on, be on the show page for the cows. Click on the link for Facebook. It'll take you right to the page. You can join up. I need to put some of the information that other guests have shared and things they talked about on the program. I need to update and add some things there. But, yeah, you can talk about guests, suggest ideas for programs. Very constructive. Want to see more people join there. So please join the Facebook group. And you can also check my blog, racism-notes.blogspot.com. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Added a couple reviews over the last few weeks, and hopefully we'll add more material. Cows, we will be back on Sunday. Sunday we will have author John Potash. He is a white male, and he wrote a book about continued COINTELPRO activity, counterintelligence program. Hopefully, if you've been following the cows, you heard when Dr. Kenneth O'Reilly was on the show, and he talked about his book, Racial Matters, about suspected racists in the FBI who mistreated non-white people, black people who were working against racism. John Potash, his book talks about how those activities have continued, and specifically he focuses on how they attacked the non-white individual known as Tupac Shakur. His book focuses on that, but also branches out to Jimi Hendrix and Bob Marley and a lot of other black people that I really hadn't even thought of as being threats to the system of white supremacy, but he shows evidence where suspected racists within the FBI conducted similar COINTELPRO operations against Tupac Shakur, Bob Marley, Jimi Hendrix, lots of other non-white people, black people. That's what we'll be talking about on Sunday. The show is at, I believe, it is 7. Let me double check here to make sure that I'm correct. It is at 7 p.m. This Sunday, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific with John Potash. That'll be Sunday. We'll actually be back Monday. We'll have MC Search on that show. We'll be back a week from today on Thursday with a black male, Lowell Mengesha. We'll be back next Saturday. We'll have 2 shows next Sunday. So if you're a fan of the cows, early part of October, we have lots of shows. Hopefully they will be constructive. Thank you for tuning in to the program. Again, please let your friends know about the show. If you think it's constructive, you can put this player on your website. There's HTML code on the Blog Talk Radio site where you can copy and paste it and put this show on your blog or any place else where you can copy and paste a little HTML code. That would be a great way to support the show. I would thoroughly appreciate it if you think the show is constructive. Please, again, let people know Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. was on the cows today. They can come and check that program out, download it, share it with your friends if you think it's helpful. For Justice, myself and today's guest, Professor Ariela Gross, University of Southern California. Hope the program was constructive. Justice, you have anything you want to say before we ride?
No.
Okay. Justice, I'm sorry?
Thank you, though.
Thank you. Thank you for your continued participation. You have contributed a ton to the context of white supremacy. Very thrilled to have you on the program and looking forward to doing it again on Sunday, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. We will be back. Justice and Gus T Renegade, the context of white supremacy. We are signing off. Thank you.
Bye.